I've read or seen, I guess, about a dozen plays by the legendary John Godber. Now, for most playwrights, that would be a pretty serious incursion into their body of work. But in the case of John Godber, knowing 12 of his plays is kind of nothing. He's extraordinarily prolific as a playwright. Uh, and he's kind of had to be, as the artistic director and creative mainstay of Hull Truck Theatre Company for over a quarter of a century. He basically financed them by writing hit after hit, most famously Up and Under and Bouncers, I think, both from 1984, Teachers from 1987, On the Piste from 1990, and many, many more, of course. In fact, in some years, he wrote a play every quarter, a new play every 3 months for the company. So my knowledge of a dozen plays really, really is just skimming the surface. I'm very, very conscious of that. Now, I talked about this a little bit in my introduction to the David Eldridge interview, but John Godber is another playwright who's oddly absent from the critical conversations that kind of comes out of university studies of theatre. I think there are several reasons for this. First, his box office success is something that some academics can be a bit snooty about, can assume that means that they're a bit lowest common denominator. Second, his plays are, of course, northern, and the extraordinary metropolitan bias of our theatre is sometimes uncritically reproduced in our criticism. And I think there is sometimes a view around that the plays may be simplistic in some way, dealing in stereotypes, pandering to their audience, which of course is something that nobody would dare to say about a revered form like pantomime. But apparently it seems okay as a way of dismissing one of the most beloved playwrights of our theatre, someone who apparently was, for quite a long time, the third most widely performed British playwright after Alan Ayckbourn and William Shakespeare. In fact, Ayckbourn's an obvious, but I think misleading comparison. It's true they both ran theatres in the north of England, that they pretty much kept going through their own writing, which required of them heroic efforts of productivity. Ayckbourn's output possibly even outstrips Godber's. But there, I think the comparison pretty much ends. Ayckbourn is a writer, a brilliant writer, I should say, who draws audiences in to enjoy his kind of painful comedies about middle class life, its inadequacies, its cruelties, its indignities, and he's brilliant at that. But the tradition he's in is perhaps the tradition of Rattigan, of Coward, of Pinter to some extent. There's a little bit of Chekhov in there too. John Godber is in a completely different tradition, although he's familiar with the art theatre model, and I want to talk to him about that actually. His theatre is very much in the tradition, I guess, of Joan Littlewood at Stratford East, Peter Cheeseman at Stoke. It's a working class popular theatre in a way. It doesn't have the same wiry political insistence as John McGrath's 784, but it's not a million miles away from 1970s popular political troops like Belt and Braces, who really embraced comedy and quite mainstream popular theatre traditions as an element in their work. In the writing of a play like Bouncers, you can see John Godber drawing on the energy of someone like Stephen Burkoff, for example. And the thing is, I think he has actually been influential on the kind of theatre that academics do tend to talk about. If you think of Bouncers, he's still his most famous play, I think. Bouncers is structured around the build-up and aftermath of an evening out in the north of England. It mixes vernacular and poetry that's rhythmic and mannered. It's comic and bleak, and that tries to draw out the sadness and desperation of this world. And it premiered professionally in 1984. And then 2 years later, you could describe Jim Cartwright's play Road in exactly the same turns. And Road, of course, is rightly considered a classic of the contemporary repertoire, but it owes a huge debt, consciously or not, to the play that prepared the way. John Godber's plays do sometimes deal in stereotypes, but they do so, I think, to open the door to the audience. Once inside the world of the play, the audience is likely to be taken somewhere more complicated, more thoughtful. One of his biggest hits, Up and Under, a play reputedly written in 5 days to save Hullchuck from bankruptcy, is a wonderful comic story of kind of hope over rational expectation, the story of a man trying to knock a useless pub rugby league team into shape to win a kind of decisive match. Brilliantly, he puts the rugby match on stage, and because that is in a certain way slightly absurd, you're rooting for the team even more, which is a very clever use of theatricality, I think. And then once you're at the end of the play, it's become a story about masculinity, about stunted ambition, about apathy and hope and inspiration. And sure, it's painted in strong colours, but by God, Gobber knows how to make those colours shine. And the plays really do go beyond stereotypes. I mean, if I were to describe his early play, September in the Rain, to you as a play about a married, middle-aged couple from Yorkshire squabbling on the beach of Blackpool where they go every year for a holiday, you might think, I know exactly what kind of play that's going to be about, what kind of play that's going to be. But actually, it's the texture of the relationships, the weight with which he's imagined those lives, and the space he's giving for the actors that make the play touching and authentic, as well as funny and familiar. Happy Jack, I think, is another play from early 80s, I think, 82, something like that. It's another play about a long marriage. In fact, he's written a lot of plays about long marriages, quite interestingly. It has a reversed kind of chronology, and it has a very much popular theatre tradition. It has a kind of playfulness with actor and role, and none of that detracts from, I think, a deeply serious story about love and loss. And interestingly, it's set in a Yorkshire mining community, which kind of gives the play just a kind of subtle political edge, made much more explicit in a play like Our House from 2001, which feels to me like a sister play to Happy Jack. Similarly, Bickering Marriage, we're looking at the full length of that marriage. The shadow of death is cast over it. But here the marriage is vividly and compellingly placed in the context of 20 years of politics that tore Britain's working class communities apart. And it's clear and unmistakable the way he's talking about how that political context has its imprint on those personal lives. More recently, I get a sense his plays have got darker. I was very impressed with Sold, a play I've only read, but a quite horrifying piece about people trafficking and the global sex trade that Hull Truck did in 2007. And then Losing the Plot from 2013 is probably a bit more in Aigborne territory, actually, and I think actually played in Aigborne's theatre in Scarborough. It's a darkly funny play about midlife crisis, about female self-assertion, and about the sources of creativity. Basically, getting the opportunity to speak to John Godber, and thank you to Anya Lark for the introduction, has made me realise how huge the John Godber-shaped gap there is in my knowledge, and I think kind of the discipline's general knowledge. And I'm really thrilled to get a chance to find out more about this remarkable writer.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thanks. Yeah, great.
That's a very lovely backdrop you have.
Yeah, all my own work.
I
do the decorating.
And how's lockdown treating you?
The novelty's just about wearing off.
Right. Yeah.
We we were doing a show that we were intending to bring to London, a new play about how the North voted for Boris, and we were bringing it to Trafalgar Studios in May, and we opened it in Wakefield, which is where I'm from, although as you probably know I live in Hull, and we were doing it in Beverley, a nice little theatre there. And we kind of we read the rooms before Boris kind of went, let's forget theatre. So we cancelled. So we've been locked down for 7 weeks.
Right.
So yeah, but we're fortunate in that there's me, Jane, there's Elizabeth and Martha, and their boyfriends. And between us, we could do a couple of Shakespeare shows in the garden. We've got if we get really desperate, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine last night, and this may be, kind of not what we want to chat about, but I think theatre faces a pretty existential look at itself.
Yeah.
Like why, what, when.
Yeah.
And we all say it's essential, don't we?
Yeah.
And it is when everything else is functioning. When you've got a health service that's functioning and the education system functioning, you'll feel it as much as us, I guess, because you're kind of thinking, what are we training people for?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And there's also that sense I get from speaking to quite a few of the playwrights I've been speaking to, who are also people who are writing plays, thinking, I kind of don't know what world I'm writing these plays for,
Of course. Yeah, and for the first month, I couldn't write. It's very interesting. I talked to a friend of mine last night, and he was talking. Did you see a blog by a guy? I think he's called Nick Olivetta. He's a San Francisco theatre maker.
Okay.
What he said was, please, let's not do, my dad doing the opening speech from Henry V, or we've got enough people doing Shakespeare online to last us a lifetime. And of course, there was an urgency, wasn't there, right from the off, like, let's all be creative. And I think people who've been creative for the last 40 years, I count myself amongst them, kind of thought, do you know what, I don't want to be creative for a month. I just want to sit and think what's happening. So I've kind of penned a radio drama, which we are recording in our house with the kids and their various boyfriends, which is a kind of response to, though by no means about COVID-19. It's about the importance of family and friends, and also how suddenly we look at a society which could be set in 1955. Yeah. We've gone back to what the importance of conversation, I guess, the importance of simple things, the importance of essential things, and we could be on for a long time chatting about this, because I think we're looking at the destruction of capitalism.
Yep.
And need, and all the things as a writer, you're probably there yourself. My life hasn't changed greatly. It's just that I don't go to Carluccio's as much.
Yeah.
You stay at home and you make work, and then you rehearse it, and then it goes on, and somebody does it, and it goes on tour, and then you go into your office and you do something else. But there is there's a danger of, where do we go from ground zero? Because we will be ground zero when everything's back to normal. What kind of work are we going to make? In fact, I've just been reading a piece about when Cromwell closed the theatres. Just having a look at what that was about. There will, of course, be an explosion of COVID stories, but nothing quite like as many as we're getting online now. And I don't know, and I read a lot of new plays, and you have to do when you live in Hull. You have to know what's happening all over the place. But I'm not sure we'll want to sit in many venues watching how difficult it is on the front line. I think that will be too real, and I think we've had our fill of that. And at the same time, I don't think there'll not be that many people wanting to see 42nd Street.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
Because well, you wouldn't be able to stage it because the cost would be prohibitive in any case, you know. So I think we are looking at. My hunch is that we will have a return to what is sometimes disparagingly called community theatre.
Interesting.
You know, a theatre working out and for its own community. But my guess is only as good as anybody else's. I really don't know. I thought we'd be ready to rock in September. I'm not sure that's the case. I was talking to that yesterday. Said he thinks next September.
Yeah. Which of course, as you say, really does pose an existential threat to theatres that are still paying ground rents and keeping things ticking over. And if they have any reserves, I mean, I don't know how long most theatres can live off their reserves.
Well, there was an article, wasn't there, yesterday? Jonathan Price and Stephen Fry and various others had signed up a thing about the arts. Most people's reserves will have evaporated by the end of April.
Yeah, right.
You know, so and you know, having run a venue for 27 years, I'm really pleased I'm not running a venue.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, because of all the difficulty and how do you pick it up, and we very quickly get out of the habit of going to the theatre. But having said that, you know, there is always hope, and it would be great if this thing could disappear very, very quickly, or we learn to live with it in some way very quickly, and we can start having a reason for existing.
Yeah.
But you know, I always think it's some measure of a society in how they treat their old people. And this, you know, when it all settles down, the death in care homes will be shocking.
Yeah.
You know? And whilst I'm not regarded as a political playwright, I think I just might be.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's by way of an introduction.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, it's very interesting to hear you think about the way that theatre might be returning to some kind of the fundamentals of its civic task in some way. And in a way, I want to take you back to some fundamentals if I can. And actually, you've mentioned that you've been writing for 40 plus years. So this question is going to be very difficult to answer in general terms. But is there a way that your plays tend to start? And by that, I mean, do you generally start by saying, there's this group of people, I've just thought about them and I think they should be a great group of people for a play? Or is it an image, or is it a character, or a line of dialogue, or a social issue, or what? Is there a typical way your plays begin?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, no, because but there is some sense of unfairness somewhere in the gestation period, whether it's bouncers, whether it's rugby league, whether it's teaching, whether it's night clubs, whether it's cocktail waitresses. There is something about a voice which is unheard that gives the kind of catalyst to make that kind of work. And if you just step back, I mean, my background, what was I came to Hull in 1984, and I would have been delighted if after 3 years I'd have been invited to work at Hull University. That was the dream ticket for me, to be a professor and to talk about plays non-stop. So my research degree, and I did a master's with Mike Patterson at Leeds, and probably know I went to Breton. So there was from a very sluggish academic start, there was really then an exponential interest in all kinds of drama. So when I took on Whole Truck, the idea of wanting to make work for an audience that weren't at that time going to that theatre became a real challenge. So there was a real kind of crossroads of my own interests, my own background, and also an audience in Hull that hadn't really been reached out to. And that is now, we call them C's and D's, some B's and some C's and D's. But it was entirely what John Littlewood was doing at Stratford East. It wasn't a million miles away from what Gavin Richardson and John McGrath have been doing with 784 and Belt and Braces.
Yeah.
So I'd come from, and I'd had an opportunity to work with Red Ladder when I was at university. So there was kind of a leftist element running through the work. But that wasn't a way to make Whole Truck work. What I needed to do was to get people in almost under false pretenses. When the play was about one thing, when it might just be about something else. Right. So, for example, the last play has been about two taxi drivers and their reaction to people thinking they're right-wingers. When in fact, of course, some taxi drivers are right-wingers, but we're dangerous if we tar everybody with the same brush. And in a way, I mean, looking back on Bouncers, I'd spent many years of unsuccessful nightclub going, so I was able to watch the Bouncers, and in Bouncers, no way celebrates the thuggish behaviour of the lads on the door. It actually, as much as it criticises the girls and the lads out on the lash, it actually shows their impotence as being quite pathetic. And I think that's really where the genesis of that play was from. And also it was because I had some friends, one became a professional boxer and one became the student British powerlifting champion. So it was a way, I think, of me qualifying my macho credentials against some of my mates who actually wore them a lot more openly in public. And also, given the fact that I'm 18 stone and 6'4", it was probably better writing about nightclub bouncers than it would have been writing about somebody going to Slade Art School at that time, if you follow the logic of that.
That's great. I want to talk about bouncers in a bit more detail later, but just kind of staying, if possible, in a more kind of general sense of what your writing process is. So you said that somewhere along the line, a sense of injustice or of unheard voices is very important. Yeah. Is that the moment where you're thinking this is a play, or is that a moment where you think, I want to write a play about this, but I don't yet know what the theatrical form might be?
So for me, I've tried to start a number of novels, and I just cannot make them work. I don't know if it's the description or the long passages of prose. I just can't see it. But I see plays very quickly. But I see plays as films in my head, which then I kind of have to translate into a theatrical realization. And because I directed all my own first plays, that I enjoy the challenge of taking the film in my head to making it a three-dimensional piece of theatre. And things like Bouncers, for example, the form of four big guys doing almost stand-up comedy routines to tell a story, and the kind of anarchic, chaotic evening, that form and content is very, very closely related. Almost, here's an example. I tried to do a screenplay of Bouncers, and nobody got it because it wouldn't become literal. It was too theatrical. And when it became literal, it diminished what it was trying to say. So we shrunk it down to, and eventually we pulled out of the deal because an episode of the Channel 4 series Bouncers would have covered what the screenplay was dealing with in a way that on stage there was elasticity and a kind of overriding arc to the event of Bouncers, which made it much more weirdly three-dimensional.
That's really interesting to me, because when you said you see them as films in your head, I am immediately thinking, but your plays seem to be so entirely theatrical. I can't think what that means. I mean, when you say, what does that mean when you say you initially see them as films in your head?
Okay, so we talked about the nature of image. So the images of, for example, let's stay with Bouncers, the four guys on a door, I see them in real locations first. I see the girls going out as real girls before I allow the guys to play those girls. I have to see the documentary reality of those characters before I can dilute them with the multi-role playing aspects, which make that work vivacious and cost effective. So, but once I've done that, and what I tend to do now is I storyboard all my work. So I've created a kind of shorthand for myself. And David Edgar invited me to the first MA in playwriting he did at Birmingham. And after I spoke for an hour, he said, "Thanks, John, you've ruined a year's MA training for it." Because like making a movie, I put a spine together, which was visual. And once I got the visual spine sorted out, I was able to hook various events from my mind's film and put them in the brackets, which would then have to be theatricalized, if you like. So with Bouncers, you know the guys are going to play the girls, but I tried to write the girls as if they were girls. But the influence on that play is Marisade. I was hugely influenced by Marisade. And part of Mike Patterson's influence on my doctorate was the German theatre and all that. Brecht, Kurtz, all those kind of Piscator, those kind of influences were on their work. But it's very difficult because, like I said right at the beginning, because I've been making work for so long, it's very. I remember. Do you remember when Alan Ayckbourn became Professor of Drama at Oxford?
Oh yeah.
He was the first Macintosh professor, and I went along to see him do a talk because I thought, well, this is a guy who obviously knows what he's talking about, and I want to listen to him. And Alan clearly knew so much about making drama and making plays that the talk seemed almost naive.
Right, that's interesting.
Good characters in a good story with a good dialogue, well told. And to a certain extent, because I've been doing it almost quarterly for the last 40 years, it's very difficult to sit down and say, well, this is how a play starts. Because, Parachayevsky said a play can start watching a guy walk past when you're on the bus. And plays can come from those places. And the gestation of any play, there's no direct line between how long you work on a play and how successful it is. I think Threepenny Opera was written in 3 or 4 days. Private Lives, I think 4 days. Bouncers, a long weekend. But the way you play with it in your head is something that frustrates and stays with you. And the more you make work, the more difficult it is, because you're kind of trying to avoid playing the same chords all the time. And to some degree, you can't help it. And I think that's why in Shakespeare, there are recurring themes and tropes and imagery, because you just cannot be a font of new thinking all the time, much as you'd like to be.
It's really interesting, that image of you don't want to keep playing the same chords all the time. I often think of that John Lennon line about he said he learned to play piano because he got bored of the shapes his hands made on the guitar. And I wondered whether, because as you say, you're enormously prolific, you've had a very long career. Have there been any moments where you have tried to force yourself to play different chords?
Yeah, I have, and unsuccessfully.
Oh, right.
And you realise, I mean, for example, I wrote On the Piece back in 1991, which went to the West End and was nominated for an Olivier Award. But it was never really the piece of work I wanted it to be. It was a piece of work that was designed to make Hull Truck a lot of money, because we needed a piece of work that would make the company a lot of money. Now, conversely, Teachers, which I wrote for £100, made Hull Truck a lot of money and kept the theatre going. But that somehow I'm happier with, because it speaks directly to the audience. So there's something about my work. When I try to hide behind the fourth wall, I kind of get lost.
Right.
When I turn it out to my natural kind of, the Brecht in me turns to the audience and says, this is a play, and we all know it's a play, but let's go on the journey. As soon as I start to play the kind of 8-bone card of you're watching me behind the fourth wall, I get unstuck. The plays, some of them have been relatively successful, people like them, but I've never really been ignited by their form, really.
Right.
I think over time that's been a weakness in some of the work. Bear in mind as well that a lot of the work I wrote when I was at Truck was there, to try to keep the theatre company going. It was literally hand to mouth, and playing quite locally as well. So we're coming back to the notion of making work that's very legible in this part of the world. Many of the plays never, didn't go to London. In fact, we stopped going to London after kind of 1998. The last time we were in London was last April with Scary Bikers, which we did, that Jane and I did. But I feel more, I guess I feel more comfortable when I'm admitting the theatricality of the work.
And can I take you back to the thing you said, which is very interesting to me, about storyboarding?
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about that? And there are two parts to this question, really. One is actually really what are you doing when you're storyboarding? And then the second thing is that John Godber, the playwright, doing that, or is that John Godber, the director, who's doing that?
Yeah, good spot. A bit of both, really. The storyboarding is literally, I drive my kids mad, because when I start to play, I get a big white piece of paper and I write out all these big blank squares, and then I start physically to draw the play. So it's almost like a movie.
Right.
So that's block, that's a scene, and that's the interval, and we've got these scenes, and then that. Now, once intellectually, if I didn't do that, I'm dealing with the chemicals in my brain, which are creating images in my head, which I then have to make into dialogue on a page.
Yeah.
So what I've made for myself is a visual flowchart where I'm able to see the play.
Yeah.
And once I can see the characters in the boxes, I then literally start adding dialogue to the boxes.
Right.
And then, because I was a teacher for some time, I then get a little red biro pen and I mark the dialogue in the boxes. So once I've seen the entire piece of work in front of me, visually, physically, on a piece of A3, I'm then able to sit down and write the play immediately onto the laptop. Because what I've done, and you're absolutely right, I've staged the play, both in my head and in front of me. But I don't worry about coming off piste. I don't worry, that's not a slavish manual that I have to work to. That's just something that at least exists. And you know when you're starting a play, you will do, if you're anything like me, you will do anything other than sit down and start the play.
Yeah.
So you walk, and then you think lights go down and there is spotlight. No, that's a cliche. Lights go down, 2 spotlights. No, okay, lights go down, an empty chair. Okay, lights go down, a noose swings across the stage. And all this kind of conflux of image shoots through your mind. At least when you're putting it on a storyboard, you're committing some kind of compromise that you have to consider, which is in front of you. And if we take the fact that all art is a compromise, we have to kind of start somewhere. And in a way, for me, we chatted about it the other day, I had three big moments in my career. One was when Richard Eyre asked me in 1988 to write about the miners' strike, and I didn't. And then subsequently, Trevor Nunn asked me on 2 occasions to write a play for the National. And I realised I couldn't write a play for more than 6 people because I never had.
Right.
Because 6 people, given the fact bouncers, teachers, shakers, up and under, Happy Jack, September in the Rain, and so on and so forth, because I'd drawn the box that my plays were happening in quite tightly and economically, suddenly Richard Eyre saying there's a cast of 20 on the Olivier stage, I didn't know what character number 19 was going to be doing at any one time. Now, that was a long time ago, and I'm probably in a better position to deal with it now. But I found myself, the more I constricted the physical side of writing the work, the easier I found the work, the easier I found the writing. Does that make sense?
That's absolutely fascinating. And can I ask, that storyboarding moment, what's happened before that? Have you been thinking, making notes, doing research? I don't know.
A lot of, well, again, I mean, for example, in 1985, I wrote a play about Karen Briggs, who was the 8 times world judo champion. He's got blood, sweat and tears. So Karen taught Jane judo, and I went to a judo club for about 6 or 7 weeks. I was thrown about, I was battered. It was a real shock to me. But a little bit like, Stanislavski and Gorky's Lower Depth, you have to find the play. So, I have never been a nightclub bouncer. I have never been a rugby league player. I've been a teacher, but I've never been a cocktail waitress. So, you have to find the work. You have to dig deep. You have to find the characters. And I enjoyed that side of the research just as much as writing the plays. Although I wouldn't say that the research is documentary in the way that some plays are. I have to kind of, it has to come through me in a certain way. So they are John Godber's, they've been passed through the filter of my experience rather than, for example, Jane wrote a play about the Spanish Civil War, which we took to Barcelona last year. And it is entirely about that, these guys from Hull who went to fight, 8 guys from Hull. Very, very well documented. If I was doing that story, it would have, there is something where it had passed through me and I would have influenced it a bit more with my view of the world. And I think that's just the way that I am. I think that's the way that I own the work.
Right. So it's the research is not so much about you immersing yourself in that world. It's kind of immersing the world into you,
Yes.
so that you can speak it.
Yes, entirely. Entirely right. So you have to kind of know it in order for you to filter it. It's a little bit like an actor playing a role, I guess. You have to feel what the weight of that is without slavishly recreating what the documentary material might have been in the first instance. That's how I found the work. That's when I found it satisfying, when that kind of thing happens.
And you mentioned that Bouncers was written in a long weekend, or at least presuming the first draft of it was written in a long weekend. Was that a younger man's energy, or would you still write a new play in a fairly intense short period?
Yeah, two things. One is I couldn't write Bouncers now because I know too much.
Right. Yeah.
I didn't know what I was doing. The play is full of energy. The play is it's too chaotic. It exists through its energy. If I was to write it now, I know too much about structure to be free and kind of destroy my own structural narrative. Having said that, I like to write plays very quickly because I rewrite so much now. So the amount of time I spend in my office, the shorter that amount of time, the better.
Right.
So if I can write a play in a week, I might then spend 4 weeks rewriting it.
Oh, really? That's
so once it exists, once I've got it in front of me, and these are great things about laptops and iPads and all those kind of things. And a little bit like Mamet's book, Writing in Restaurants, I will spend as little time as I possibly can in my office. Because it's me in my office writing my play, and I'm away from the world. Whereas once it's on the computer, I can go into a cafe, have some lunch, go to a shopping centre even. And there's something about writing in public. There's something about just, I don't know, is it to do with justifying our existence as writers? Is it about, the Alan Bennett thing of picking up the odd line on the back of a bus? I don't know. But I feel more connected when I'm writing in a public place than I do hidden away in the garden.
And so let me ask you about rewriting then, because that's really interesting that the rewriting process would take longer than the first drafting. Obviously, you've written so many plays. How do you approach rewriting? Is it a matter of taking something that perhaps was written in a big sort of intense, intuited, not splurge, that sounds very rude, but a very intense process of creation, and then breaking it down and seeing it in a more technical problem solving way? Exactly
that. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say splurge, I'd say vomit. Get it out, get them out, pass them, and once they're out there, once the kind of energy, the visceral energy of the play is out, then apply the intellect. And that's what I'm finding more and more interesting. I'm getting better at letting other people see my work as well. I mean, this is, as you might appreciate, you probably feel it yourself, particularly those close to you, you don't really want them casting their opinions over a work that's not yet there. Yeah. But that can be quite healthy. It's painful, but it can be quite healthy. I do not at all worry about cutting the work if it doesn't work when it's on its feet.
Right.
If it doesn't instantly work, you kind of know this is never going to work, and maybe it shouldn't have been there in the first place.
Does that have an effect on the writing in the sense that you know you're going to direct it? Is there a sort of division of labor there where you can kind of, I suppose you can allow yourself as a writer to say, I'll keep it in because director me can always sort out the problem in the room?
Yeah, what's surprising on this last play, for example, I thought I'd done. I mean, we went into the read-through with the play, and everybody said, this is a cracker. This is just, it's electric. And 10 days into rehearsal, Jane came in to see some of it, and she said, that doesn't work. And it worked on the page, but it just did not work on its feet. And I said, no, it actually does work because that theme is developed here, and he's now speaking about this when that's, and no matter how much I wrestled with it, the sad truth was it just didn't work. Right. But on the page, as a piece of literary evidence, it patently worked as a read.
Yeah.
As soon as you put it up and you kind of go, and one of the things about it was that I was in the play, my daughter Martha was in the play, one of my ex-students, who was a very, very, very big guy, he was in the play. And was it the fact that we were three physically big people? I mean, Aid is 6'8", you know, we couldn't make this piece of work, which became very, very poetic and lyrical, and he started singing. And when everybody went, why the fuck is he singing? You know, but at the read-through, we all went, that's going to be a great moment. So we kind of constantly, I think, go back to what are plays? Are they things that are in books, or are they things that happen in front of 300 people? And always I'd say it's about what happens in front of 300 people. If you're lucky, 600 people.
What's interesting, there's an interesting question in sort of forming our mind there, because I guess a writer who doesn't direct their own work, which of course is most playwrights, that might be able to say to themselves, and of course sometimes they might be right, well, they couldn't make it work, but a different director might be able to make it work.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No.
Is there ever a sort of bit in thing in your mind where the playwright you is quite cross with the director you because the director you can't make something that could actually work in a different production? Do you see what I mean?
I had a guy called Mark Clements used to run Derby Playhouse. I don't know if you remember Mark, but he went to run Milwaukee Rep, 3 or 4 massive theatres. He was a fantastic interpreter of my work, and I'd see things that he'd done that I thought, I usually cut that. But he made it work. And it similarly in Bouncers in LA, when Ron Link directed them, there were sections of the show that he made work, and I just couldn't make it work. And that's also to do with where we think the genesis of the writing is coming from. If there is an honesty in the storytelling, and in the recent play, these 3 taxi drivers tell the story of why the North voted for Boris, despite the fact that they didn't. And now the fact we will never have a Labour government ever again. And the more this goes on, I think that's probably sadly going to be the case when we get the state paying people's wages. But there was something very clear about the section I'm speaking about in this play, where the storytelling authenticity of the characters wouldn't suddenly allow one of the characters to do something that wasn't authentic. Having said that, in another production, it's quite likely that there may have been room within the production for a director to get that through, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So there is another issue, and the other issue is of time. And because we were working to a very, very tight rehearsal schedule and an opening, and that was all predicated on when London was going to happen, we really didn't have 5 or 6 days to look at how one scene would work.
Right.
So you're then thinking, look, if this works, great. If this is not working, we're really going to have to do some surgery on it. and move on. And we persevered with it right until the final kind of run-throughs, and eventually it was the performers saying, this just doesn't feel right. So we bin it, you know, and there are some things, of course, that you don't want to bin because you really feel them. But there's other work where you think, no, actually, the play will exist perfectly well without that sequence. And sometimes by taking out a sequence, the play kind of ratchets into focus much more. But I still find writing plays and working on them interesting for these reasons.
Mm. I have to say, it's terribly reassuring that even John Godber sometimes writes things and can't quite make them work in performance. I think that'll cheer a lot of playwrights up.
Absolutely.
Can I ask you a different question about time, actually, since you just mentioned it, which is something about pace, because I feel kind of awkward kind of asking this question. Do you think of your plays as comedies? Because I think they're very funny and they have a real comic energy very often, not always, but very often they do. Do you think of them as comedies when you're writing them?
No, I don't think I do. I think I see them as acts of catharsis, really. And when we're back to why do we write? We write to try to understand the world. I think that's the bottom line of any writer. If you go in and you want him to write Hamilton and you want to earn a fortune, you're starting from the wrong place. I think Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote Hamilton because he wanted to express his view about American history and race.
Yeah.
So there was a real sense of wanting to get a point across. You have to have, rather obviously, something that you want to say. It can be the tiniest thing. It can be a massive thing. I think the fascinating thing again about when I'm doing my storyboard, in a weird way, when I'm boiling the play down to its essence, what's left in the crucible at the end, there has to be something there. It can be tiny, and in some Waiting for Godot is a very, very good example, isn't it? You know, it's about nothing, but actually it's about everything.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think what we tend to do is, you start with a real panorama of I want to talk about these kind of big issues and all the rest of it, and then once it's kind of boiled down, you realise it's a grain of salt, but it's a pretty dense grain of salt. But you have to. I think the other thing, I'm just coming off that question slightly, but I think you have to know what else is out there. You have to know. Years ago, when I first came to Hook Truck, most of the people, and I'm told Danny Boyle was one of them, who had applied for the job, had come to Hull and said they wanted to write a play about fishing. And I'd said I wanted to write a play about rugby. And I got the job because fishing was a bit obvious for Hull. Now rugby was quite obvious, but fishing was more obvious. So, and I came to rugby because I'd done my MA research degree on David Storey, who had written The Changing Room of This Sporting Life. So you have to know, one of the other things about starting to write a play, in my mind, is if I came to you and said, I've got a great idea about 4 redundant Sheffield steelworkers who, in order to gain custody of one of their kids, decide to do a strip. And if you'd not known what that was about, you'd say that's a great idea. So we're constantly, aren't we, borrowing from somebody's idea of what somebody's done, what somebody hasn't done, and so on and so forth. So all our work, I mean, it's a quote from that John Willett book, the Theatre of Bertolt Brecht. We're all magpies.
Right. Yeah. Can I ask a couple of very nuts and bolts questions? I think you've answered this already, but you type your plays. Have you always typed your plays?
No, no. Some of them, and I realised when I was telling you about the storyboard, some of them I've sat down and wrote in longhand.
Huh. Is there a difference in that experience between typing and writing?
Yeah. The energy of the longhand, because I can write quicker than I can type, the energy of the longhand, the work is done extra quick. And if we go industrial on this, let's say that we want to get 90 pages done. I tend to get up very, very early in the morning, 4 o'clock, and write as much as I possibly can before 8 o'clock. Because for me, the pain of writing a play is the worst thing about being a playwright. The good thing about being a playwright is marking your work when it exists. So I would say to any new writer, don't sit looking at a blank piece of paper. Write something, even if it's bollocks. Because when the academic or the kind of literary aspect of your mind, when you go back to look at the work, you think, what was I thinking? What was I thinking when I wrote that? That's absolute rubbish. But because, and again, this has been fueled by running a company, that we had to get work out very quickly. There were some times when I wondered, I didn't know what the play was about until I saw the poster.
Right.
That's pretty industrial.
Yeah.
And we knew that you could only have 4 actors, 3 actors, so many actors. And this would be an anathema to Richard Bean, and David Eyre and these kind of people. And I guess even James Gray, and James I knew when it was a student at Hull University, because we were having to try, we were feeding all the people who work for the theatre company. And it was through we used to have a meeting at board meetings, and the first question was, how many actors can we afford?
Yeah.
Right. And that came up to me, sadly, before what's the play about?
Right. Huh.
That is I wouldn't recommend anybody goes on that particular route, but what it did do, it spawned 60-odd plays. All of them were performed, all of them created a kind of buzz and brought in an audience. And there must be something within that, the necessity of pushing that writing, that made that work exist. And I think if I'd not got the job running Hull Truck, I clearly wouldn't have written as many plays.
Sure. And this is a stupid question to ask somebody who's written 60+ plays, but have you ever had writer's block?
I've had, let's just say I've had aspects of it.
Okay.
I've had plays that I knew were opening in May, that Act 1 was finished in March, and Act 2 was still unwritten in April.
Okay.
So I'd be writing Act 2 whilst we were rehearsing Act 1.
Okay.
That's pretty tense.
And how do you sort of get, if you're in a state of going, I don't know how to do this, but you've got an opening in 5 weeks, how do you get over that writer's block? How do you make yourself write?
Well, again, you're down to the practicalities that if this play goes shit, the theatre closes.
Right.
Yeah. It is, and weirdly, it's only now. In fact, again, I chatted to Jane last night, and I've got my birthday in May, and I'm kind of thinking, I don't really know. I feel like I'm at the crossroads. And she said, you don't have to write any more plays. And that realization of suddenly, oh no, I don't have to write any more plays, but I want to, because that's the way I understand the world.
Right.
What I don't do now is write a play and then immediately put it on, because that that's a young man's game.
Okay.
You know, that really is something that you want to be doing in your late 20s, early 30s. You come to 60, you know, you want to love all your players, and you want to say you've given each player the same amount of time and attention and affection, but that just can't, it can't be the case. Some will come. I mean, Aigborn says, doesn't he, 1 in 3, only 1 in 3 is any good.
Right. Huh. That's still pretty good. That's still a pretty good percentage.
Yes, sure. But it does give you the kind of, and actually, I think it might have been Eve Andrew Nielsen that I read a thing where he said, Anthony Nielsen, where he said, write it as if your life depends on it. And when I've written where my life hadn't depended on it, the plays haven't been so good.
That's very sick. Can I ask you a really, really nerdy question?
Yeah, sure.
When you are typing your plays, what font is John Godber's favourite play font?
Times Roman.
Times Roman, which is so far proving to be the runaway winner among playwrights, I will say. Can I just ask a few questions about bouncers? This is the copy I bought when I was a student. It says October 1988 in there. And I realized, of course, as I was sort of preparing for this, that this is the version of the play from 1984's production. There was a version from 1977. I think you wrote for Bretton Hall. You did a remix in 91. And I think there's another one in 2007.
Yeah.
So is any of them definitive? Do you think you may ever do Bouncers again and rewrite it again?
Well, strangely, I'm on the board of the Royal Court in Liverpool.
Yeah.
And last year they did a BMAE version of it, and a writer, Maurice Besman. Do you know Maurice's work?
I don't actually.
Okay. Well, he's a black writer, and they approached me and said, "Look, we want to do a black Bouncers." And it was fantastic. And they were going to take it to Edinburgh. They set up a company called Boisterous. They're worth having a Google. Very, very physical, because they felt that there wasn't really a work for a black audience in Liverpool. But they did an absolutely up to date what the experience of young BMA people were in and around Liverpool at club going. Now, essentially, it was Bouncers, but some of it was Morris's own scenes put within the framework of the play, and it worked fantastically well. The last version I did, I updated it. I thought it was fine. A lot of people wanted to see the 1980s version. A lot of people felt that it is about, you know, that period of Chaka Khan and chic and disco going and the glitter balls and all that kind of thing.
Right.
And of course, the drug scene's very different, so on and so forth. I think now I'm unlikely to do another Bouncers, but the version you've got there, that was the very first one was a two-hander. That was in 1977.
Okay.
That I did with a guy called, you might know John Bennett from Liverpool Hope, Dr. John Bennett.
Oh yes, of course.
Well, John was in the original Bouncers. He played the student who got humiliated. I think he's probably over it now. But and that was a two-hander. And then in 1980, I wrote it as a 4. So I had it in my kind of arsenal when I came to run Old Truck. It's hard because it's on the kind of national curriculum for A-level and GCSE drama. And I'm not bored by it, but what I'm told is that lots of adolescent lads respond to the work because they feel it's got something to say to them. And whilst ever it's got something to say to a new generation, I think it's certainly it's fantastic that they're getting something out of it. But the whole night, I mean, again, you know, where we are now, who knows if nightclubs will ever become a thing again, you know. But male pride and macho kind of preening, that's, you know, that's going to be with us for a long time.
It was really interesting when you were talking earlier about your university experience and getting very interested in German theatre of the 20s, kind of expressionist theatre and so on. As you were saying that, I was kind of going, I wonder if there's a relationship to the plays. And I thought, actually, Bouncers has got a lot of that. The use of the ensemble, the highly patterned kind of speech, the sense of a kind of ritual. Is that, am I just making random connections, or was there a connection in your mind?
No, I mean, for me, Bouncers is it's almost like a Berlin cabaret show. When we first did it in Hull, the theatre was 100-seater, and it was like a hot box. I mean, you know, it's 4 big guys physically sweating in front of you with this, you know, and when we did it at Edinburgh in 1984, we were in the supper room at the Assembly Rooms, and we performed it at midnight. And it was almost like this kind of immersive, secret circus act, which, and yeah, you know, we could go back again, as I said, to Mike Patterson and the From Morn Till Midnight, and the kind of very strong images, and, you know, Marisade, direct audience address, Brecht's Leerstück, you know, plays which are about, let's do that scene again and let's do it from a different angle.
Yeah.
And the whole thing about Lucky Eric's first speech, when we, you know, demystification of what the play's about. They were all in the mix through the time I was doing my PhD with Mike, and after I was left. You must know of the Workshop Theatre.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and all those. Well, I went to the Workshop Theatre with Mike and Martin Bannon. So all those influences eventually kind of yielded in Bouncers. And in the other work, I think sometimes Bouncers became too funny in performance. And I think that sometimes weakened the productions.
That's very interesting, because I was struck again, because obviously I read this, as I say, when I was a student, and I think I read it again sort of 10 years ago, something like that. But reading it yesterday, I was thinking it's interesting, because obviously on one level, and I mean this in a completely positive way, it sort of gets onto the stage by sort of creating some stereotypes, but the action of the play is to kind of complicate those as it goes on. And I can sort of, and Eric is the best example of that, I guess, but I can see that a version that keeps it being funny won't ever quite get to where someone like Eric has to go. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Yeah, we found in performance, it's a very interesting thing, because do you know Vesta Tilley?
Mm-hmm.
Well, isn't it fascinating that we, you know, when we talk about Bouncers, we're not a million miles away from Mrs. Brown's Boys.
Right, yeah.
And the interesting thing when we did Shakers is we wondered why. Could women be as funny playing men as the men were playing women? And the sad truth was, it was never as successful. And is there something genetic, or is it about our perceived idea of role, that when the big guys start to become the women, if they send the women up, it's absolutely, it just dies on its arse. But if they try to play the women with whatever integrity they can muster, we see the women coming through the male performances. And what it does, it demonstrates the ineptitude of the men to tell the story, but it also illustrates how their masculinity confines their understanding.
Yes.
And I've been in audiences where feminists have gone mad at the multi-role play. But in a sense, that's missing the point, because, and I'm bound to say that, and for me, it's missing the point because what the bouncers are trying to demonstrate in their storytelling is how pathetic we all are under those circumstances. There's a line in Educating Rita where I think Rita says there ought to be better songs to sing than this. And that's entirely my point in bouncers. Yeah. That, you know, lads go out to get pissed, girls go out to get pissed. And between the two, there is great disappointment, upset, futility. And unless you're very lucky, there's a big 18-stone guy who's going to thump you in the back of the head for no good reason. Now, that is no way to go out and seek a member of the opposite sex. And yet, it continues. And yet, you know, we can segue into posh. You know, we can segue into the Bullingdon Club. So this is not just necessarily the antics of, you know, of East End lads and you know, northern working class activities. That animalism, if you like, is with us all over the place. And in the centre of it is Eric, who unfortunately has a brain and has a sensitivity. And in a weird way, that kind of dialectic was my experience growing up. You know, that we, I said, I played a lot of sport, played a lot of rugby, a lot of football, a lot of, you know, around boxers and weightlifters and all that. But I would go home and read Balzac, or I would go and read Thérèse Racan. And these guys were, they hadn't gone through that portal into further education.
And there have been all-female productions, haven't there, of bouncers?
There's been, yeah. I've never seen any, but there have been some. A lot of student groups do it and school groups, and of course there are now lots of female, you know, door supervisors and all that. But I think the experience really is quite different.
Right.
Essentially the same, but in many ways quite different.
And the updating that we talked about at the beginning of this, that, you know, it's been rewritten a number of times, and that's true of other plays of you. I think Teachers, you say at the beginning that you should update the references whenever that's done. Is that very important to you, that the plays need, in a sense, they're provisional, that each time they're done they should be slightly reinvented?
Yeah. You can't do it with all the plays. Some of the plays are too specific. September in the Rain, Happy Jack, Happy Family, Salt of the Earth. They're too time locked. And in fact, as I've got older, I'm not quite sure that Teachers does reach outside its time. I think education has changed so much that if you upgraded and re-referenced some of the stuff in Teachers, it would still feel like it was 1991 or 19. You know, because education is now, it's a very, even though the themes are still there, and the fact that working class kids are not having the opportunity to do drama in schools, drama's being cut, or kind of arts budgets are being savaged in schools, that remains a truism, but the detail of the play has changed and is quite different. The Bouncers, what I wanted in Bouncers was for people to make it speak to the audience in whichever locale it was performed. So it didn't feel like it was in any way a museum piece. I think as I've got older, I've softened a bit with that. And I'm not quite sure, because what that leads quite often to people taking liberties with it. And you go and see the play, and you know, so why have you done that? Oh, well, we took your note about changing it, and there was a bloke who lived 2 doors away, and we thought we'd put him in a scene, you know, and then you've lost the play. Really.
Yeah, sure.
So, I think plays are fluid, you know, and I think our reaction to them is fluid. I think, you know, you can see a play, and you can come out of the theatre saying, I hated that play. And a month later, you can turn around and say, that was one of the best plays I've ever seen.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Last question. So you've been writing plays for, well, if Bouncers was one of your first plays, at least 43 years. What have you learnt? What can you do now that you didn't know how to do in 1977?
Well, I can write a play. I think, do you know what? I don't think I'm smug, which I think means to keep an open mind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think once you think you've got it, you've lost it. You know, once you think that's just add water and mix, you finish. And once, you know, if I leave this discussion and go in and look at the awards and the bloody gongs and the BAFTAs, I'm dead. And I think that's really critical for writers. You have to stay in the game, because when you think you're on it and you've arrived, that's when I think it's time to, you know, give it up. I think the risk of writing another play is the excitement. So whatever you may have learned, it's of no use. The now is everything.
Fantastic. John Godber, thank you so much for your time. That was really kind, very generous. I hope we get to see the Taxi Driver play. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Nice to talk to you. Take care.
And you. Cheers. Bye-bye.